Hello, everyone. In today's case, we will be covering a very unusual killer who went by the nickname of Jolly Jane. Today, we will be discussing Jane Toppan, who was born Honora Kelly on March 31st, 1854. Sadly, her mother died of tuberculosis when she was very young, and her father was a well-known eccentric and an abusive alcoholic. In 1860, only a few years after his wife's death, Jane's father took his two youngest children, Jane, who was 6, and Delia, who was 8, to the Boston Female Asylum, which was an orphanage for indigent girls. He surrendered them to the orphanage and never saw them again. According to the asylum records, the girls were, quote, rescued from a very miserable home, end quote. No additional records exist from their time at the asylum. Allegedly, Delia went on to become a prostitute, and another older sister, Nellie, was committed to an insane asylum in 1862. Jane was placed as an indentured servant in the home of Mrs. Anne C. Toppan, and Jane later went by their surname, even though no formal adoption had taken place. The Toppans had a daughter, Elizabeth, who Jane was on good terms with. After Anne died and Elizabeth married and moved out of the family home, Jane no longer was needed as a servant. In 1885, Jane began training to be a nurse at Cambridge Hospital. Unlike her early years, where Jane was described as brilliant but terrible, at the hospital she was well-liked, bright, and friendly, which earned her the nickname Jolly Jane. Jane would single out patients which she claimed were her favorite. Often these patients were elderly and very sick. By favorite, I mean she thought elderly people were useless and not worth keeping alive. She used these patients as her own personal guinea pigs. She used the drugs morphine, opium, and atropine. She would alter their prescribed doses to see what effect it would have on their nervous systems. Due to the fact that she spent considerable time alone with these patients, she made fake medical charts for them, pulled them in and out of consciousness with different medications, and even climbed into bed with them. She killed at least a dozen people while working as a student nurse. She would experiment with the drugs mentioned before and increase the dosage until it became lethal, although sometimes she would drug a patient right up to the point of death and then nurse them back to health, claiming it was a miraculous recovery. After finishing her residency at the hospital, Jane became a private nurse for families around Boston, for years without detection, killing older family members and stealing their property. She didn't limit her murderous intentions to only her patients. She also killed landlords, fellow doctors and nurses, and even friends when she became bored of their company. She wasn't caught until she used a heavy metal poison on one of her victims, which was detectable and sparked an investigation. In 1902, a criminal trial was held, and she was amazingly found not guilty. Jane then decided to tell her attorney that she had, in fact, killed over 100 people and often got into bed with them as they convulsed from the poison, as it brought her sexual pleasure. She was promptly brought in for another trial and sentenced to life in an asylum. When she was first brought to the asylum, Jane refused to eat because she feared her food had been poisoned, which the newspaper stated that would be ironic revenge. Jane remained at the asylum until her death on October 29, 1938. Psychiatrists today, looking back at Jane, agree that, like most other serial killers, she had a rough childhood. She was an angel of death poisoner, which isn't that uncommon. However, what makes her a very interesting case study is that she derived a sexual thrill from committing these murders. As her victims lay dying, she got an erotic thrill from caressing and holding them. Most murderers who get a sexual thrill from their crimes are male, and not angel of death killers. Poison is more frequently used as a murder tool by women, but these killers operate from a distance and don't generally cozy up to their victims at the moment of death.